In the first character tutorial that I made, I left out a few things that weren't strictly necessary so that the video could stay bite-sized and straightforward. I'm going to be adding on to that video's knowledge with this video by going over tainted characters, pocket actives, character-specific costume sprites, and how to prevent character-specific costume sprites like clothes and hair from being rerolled by the D4 or removed when entering the Knife Piece 2 sequence. Obviously, this will be using the same mod as the first character tutorial, so please watch that one first if you haven't. You can find the mod used there by following the GitHub link in the description. Tainted Gabriel starts with a pocket active. A pocket active is also known as an active item in the bottom right of your screen, like where your cards and pills usually go. This pocket active will create a large puddle of holy water creep right under Tainted Gabriel. Tainted Gabriel will also no longer have a trail of holy water creep wherever he walks. The first thing we'll do is to define the character in the XML. This is actually super simple. Alright, I'm here in the XML. Highlight all of your original player tag for your character, then go a few new lines and copy-paste it. I'll add a new attribute at the end of this tag and call it bSkinParent. Then set it to the name of the original character, which will be Gabriel. And that's it, you now have a tainted version of your character. You can keep the name attribute here the exact same if you want to, as you can specify if you're searching for a tainted character pretty easily when grabbing the ID of the character in Lua. Alright, let's first update the sprites of our tainted character before I go over the other attributes I'll be adding. Here in my costumes folder, you'll find a costume called character_Gabriel_B.png. I've opened it up in Sprite, which is a pixel art editing program. As you can see, he has gone completely bald. Well, not completely. Now let's go back to the main characters folder, and you'll notice a new folder named costumes_GabrielB. Inside this folder, you'll see two new costumes with names that seem to relate to Lazarus. A really neat feature I didn't go over in the first video is that you can define a folder that holds character-specific costume sprite sheets. This means that you can put sprite sheets in here and change costumes for your character and your character only. The names of these two sprite sheets corresponds to the names of the sprite sheets used by Tainted Lazarus's null costumes, as you can see in the Isaac Costumes reference spreadsheet, which is linked in the description. The reason I'm replacing these null costumes is because in the Knife Piece 2 escape sequence, the game rids you of all of your costumes. Additionally, when using the D4, you'll lose all of your null costumes. The issue is that mods have no way of preventing this normally. The solution is to make our character start with another vanilla character's null costume using an XML attribute, then replace the sprite sheets with this folder. Costumes added through XML are never removed unless the player changes their character. Hopefully that's understandable. We're just going to give our character a null costume of another vanilla character, that null costume being something that isn't used in any other circumstance, so it's safe to replace. We're then just replacing it by naming our sprite sheets the exact same name as the way those sprite sheets are named in the files, and putting them in our character-specific sprite sheet folder. Alright, let's go back to the XML and actually set all of this up. In here, add a new attribute named costume_suffix, and then set this to Gabriel B. The game will search within this folders here with the name costumes_, and then the costume suffix you define. So for me, that's gfx/characters/costumes_Gabriel B. Next, add the costume attribute, and set it to the ID of the costume you're going to replace. You should look in the Isaac Costumes reference spreadsheet and find a character-specific costume that is on the layer or layers that suits your needs. On screen, this number here is the ID of the costume, and none here means it's a null costume. Head 0 here, which is to the right of the sprite sheet itself, is the layer the sprite appears on. This 99 here is the priority of the costume. If you're confused on what that means, consider checking out my costumes tutorial, which you can find by pressing the button on the top right of the screen. So I'm going to be setting costume to 104, because that's the ID of the costume with the sprites that I'm replacing. Next, let's start replacing sprite sheets. Let's update the portrait attribute to the file name of the tainted version of Gabriel's portrait. I've put it in the exact same location, but I've added a _b to the end of the file name. Next, we need to update the skin, or the sprite sheet of the character. Again, it's in the same location for me, so just character _Gabriel_b.png, because that's what I named it. The last thing I want to do is update the name image attribute, which is for the boss versus screens. Tainted characters in the vanilla game usually keep this the same as their normal counterpart, and so do most modded characters. But I've changed it to this image, which is the exact same sprite, but with a huge exclamation mark I added. I think it's sort of funny. Alright, now that we're done with the XML, hit save, and we can go over adding tainted co-op, controls, death screen, and menu sprites. Oh, one last thing, I'm going to make it so the character no longer starts with holy water. In my content/GFX folder, you'll notice 5 new files. The names of these files all have an alt at the end of them. These act the exact same way as their non-alt counterparts, but only work for tainted characters. The way these are named are a little inconsistent, so I'm going to go over each one. First is character menu alt.anim2. This is the sprites for the character select screen, excluding the character's portrait. Next is character portraits alt.anim2, which is pretty self-explanatory. After that, we have controls alt.anim2, and note how this anim2 has a space in the name between alt and controls. This is the floor tutorial sprite for our character. Also notice that since this is a pocket active item, the null layer that I'm using is pillcard2, which will show the controls to pocket active items. Now we have co-op menu alt, which also has a space in the name. And finally, we have death screen alt. Just like the name image sprite, this is usually kept to the exact same sprite as the normal counterpart. I made it look sort of silly instead, for demonstration purposes. Do note that if you don't provide any of these alternate anim2s, the game will just fall back to the one for the normal version of your character. Okay, let's go in game and test out Tainted Gabriel. So, new run, press E, and there we are. In game, it looks like our costume was applied correctly. Okay, I'm right at the mines entrance. Entering the door, you'll see all of my costumes go away, excluding my character's scalp and souls. And the same is for the D4, where using it will not get rid of my null costumes. Alright, that's about everything. The last thing I'm going to do will be using Lua, where I'll make the character start with the active item and make the active item actually do something. Alright, right now I'm in my main.lua. If I quickly switch over to my items.xml, you'll see I've already made an active item. The active item is named Holy Outburst, and is a timed active with a 3-second charge. Remember that max charges is equal to frames when the charge type is set to timed. And 30 frames is 1 second, so this will be a 3-second charge. Pocket actives are the exact same as normal actives, so there's no need to do anything special here. Back to main.lua, let's start coding. This is all the code from the previous tutorial. Don't worry about it much, because I'm just going to scroll all the way to the bottom and write some new code under this dotted line. First, let's get the character ID for Tainted Gabriel. Do local tainted Gabriel type equals Isaac.get player type by name Gabriel, which is the name we defined in the XML. And be sure to add an extra argument that's set to true here. This second argument tells the game we're looking for a tainted character specifically. I have typed this variable in shouting snake case, which is all caps with underscores between the words. I do this because the variable is a constant, meaning I never intend to change it, and doing it this way helps me immediately know that, and keeps my code readable. It's not required, and I didn't do that up here for these variables because, well, I forgot. But I always recommend making your constant variables look like this if you're working on a more complex project. Next, I'll get the item ID for Holy Outburst, our pocket active. Local Holy Outburst ID equals Isaac .get item ID by name, holy outburst, which is what we defined in the XML. The last thing you'll want to do is define a variable that holds the game object, which you only need to create once in your entire mod. We'll use this later, so just put local game equals game. Alright, now that we have the IDs that we need, we can make the player start with the item. We want the player to start with the active item, so I'm going to make a new callback that'll hook into MC post player init. Make some new lines and then do function myCharacterMod, or whatever your mod's variable is. Then tainted Gabriel init with an open parenthesis. The game provides the player as an argument for this callback, so I'll just put player between these parentheses. Just like in the last video, I'm going to be using Lua type annotations so that I can get type recognition for this variable that I know will be an entity player. Basically, that means I'll be receiving autocorrect whenever I try to use a method or access a property specific to the entity player. I go over this in detail in the mod structure tutorial, which you can find by clicking the button in the top right of the screen. If you haven't watched that video, please remember that you'll need these two Visual Studio Code plugins on screen to do this. The type annotation stuff is completely optional, but it makes coding a lot easier as you don't have to switch between the docs as much. So right above the function, do @param player, or whatever you named the argument here, and then type entity player to tell Visual Studio Code that the player argument is meant to be an entity player. Alright, make a few new lines and close that function. Before we can actually give the pocket active item, we have to make sure that the player we're being given is Tainted Gabriel, as this callback will run for any character type. Just like up here with handle starting stats, we're going to check if it's not Tainted Gabriel, and if that's the case, use the return keyword to end the function right then and there before the rest of the code can execute. Doing it this way ensures that you won't have to have all of your code nested inside an if statement, and just makes things neater to read. So do if player get player type, which is the character ID of the player, then a tilde and equal sign, which means not equal to, tainted Gabriel type, then. And then just put a little return here. So again, this will check if the player is not equal to Tainted Gabriel, and if they're not equal to Tainted Gabriel, it will end the execution of this function right here before the code after it. Now, under all of this, we can give the player Holy Outburst as a pocket active. This part is a little janky due to the weirdness with the modding API, so make sure to listen closely. First, we use a setPocketActiveItem method on the player. This takes 3 arguments, which I'll go over right now. Do player setPocketActiveItem, open parenthesis, then the ID of the active item, so Holy Outburst ID. After that, the game wants us to put the active slot that the item will go in. An active slot is just a slot in which the active item can actually be in. So either the top left primary slot, the top left secondary slot with school bag, the bottom right pocket active slot, and the bottom right secondary pocket active slot, which is only used for dice bag. There's an active slot enumerator for this, and if you're using this method, you'll want to do active slot dot slot pocket. Oops. Okay, this last argument is where things get a little weird. This is the keep in pools argument, as you can see here. It's intended to determine whether or not the active item should be removed from its item pools or not when given to the player. But it's bugged to where setting it to false, which would usually get rid of the item in the item pools, will cause the game to instantly crash if the run is continued after closing and reopening the game. Because of this, we're forced to set this to true. Obviously though, there is a problem if you want the active item to not appear in the pools defined in itempools.xml when given to your character, which is how it works for vanilla pocket actives. Instead, we're going to have to remove it from the pools manually. Close up this method here and make a few new lines. Okay, turns out I made a little typo here, sorry. First, we need to get the item pool object. This is an object, like this game object is, that holds a bunch of useful methods relating to the item pools. So to get the item pools object, do local pool equals game, get item pool. Again, we're using the game object here to get the item pool object. All right, this next part is pretty straightforward. On a new line, call the remove collectible method on the item pool object, with your active item's ID as the argument. So pool remove collectible holy outburst ID. All right, that's all for that. Now let's hook it into the MC post player init callback. Make a few new lines under this function and do my character mod add callback mod callbacks.mc post player init. Then my character mod dot tainted Gabriel, not a colon. All right, this last part is pretty simple. We're going to make a callback that'll run when our item is used, which will spawn a huge puddle of holy water creep. So create a few new lines and do function my character mod holy outburst use. We'll actually be provided 6 different arguments in this callback, but we only need the third one, which is the player. Since we only need the third argument, we can have underscores for the names of the first 2, and then just not include the names of the last 3. An underscore tells Lua that you won't be using whatever argument comes in this order, which is very useful for readability. So put these 2 underscores, then type player, or whatever you want. Remember that the type annotations that I did up here are completely optional. I only really add them when I'm calling a method or function of an object, and I don't really want to have to switch back and forth between the community docs and my code to see what arguments to put. The only thing I need from the player is their position, so create a new line and type local spawn pos equals player.position. Alright, now let's actually spawn the creep. So do local creep equals Isaac.spawn, then the type of the entity. Creep is an effect entity, so I'll put entity type.entity effect. Then the variant, which I'll use effect variant dot player creep holy water. Then the subtype, which doesn't really matter, so I'll just put 0. Then the position variable that we got up here, so spawn pos. Next is the velocity, which is the speed and direction it'll be moving in upon spawn. We don't want it to slide around, so I'll put vector.0, which is a constant vector with x and y values of 0. Lastly, we have to put the thing that spawned the creep, so just put the player. After we close that, we want to turn this entity into an entity effect. Remember that an entity effect is an entity, but an entity is not an entity effect. Entity effects have special properties and methods that normal entities do not have. So to convert it to an entity effect, just do :2 effect at the end. If this were to fail and it wasn't able to turn whatever we spawned into an effect, this would just return nil. Thankfully though, we know it's going to be an effect every time. So this is going to return the entity turned into an entity effect. Alright, create a new line. Next we just want to make the creep super large. We'll do this by changing the scale property of the creep to 2. So creep.scale equals 2, so it'll be 2 times the size it normally is. And after that, we have to manually call an update on the creep's logic. Creep is a little strange in that it won't respect certain properties upon immediately spawning in, such as size, and will take a single frame to update. To avoid there being a frame where it's an incorrect size, we just have to update the creep's logic immediately by doing a new line and calling creep:update. Now lastly, just do return true as the last line. In the active item video, I showed you that you can use the return keyword to give the game a few values that let it know how to handle a use, such as if to play the use animation or to discharge the item. The way I showed you gives the most amount of control by using a table, but a shortcut you can do is just to return the value true. This will discharge the item, play the animation, and make sure the item doesn't disappear on use. Alright, now let's hook the callback into the mc_use_item event and specify that we only want it to run for our active item. So make a few new lines under this function and type my character mod add callback mod callbacks.mc_use_item, and then the name of your function with a dot instead of a colon, so my character mod.holy outburst use. Then finally a third parameter, which is the ID of the active item. Remember, certain events let you give a third value, which specifies when your callback is run. Alright, make sure to save your file, and let's go into the game to test. Alright, I have the Holy Outburst item. And going into a room and using it, it works. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you need any extra help, make sure to join my Discord server or the Modding of Isaac Discord server. And that's everything. Goodbye.